Paul Metsa's Wall of Power TV is brought to you in part by Iron Range Resources and Rehabilitation, Two Gingers Irish Whiskey, Grey Wolf Lodge, your home away from home in the North Woods, and the Solar Arts Building in Northeast Minneapolis. This program was produced and originally broadcast in 2017.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Wall of Power. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. Tonight we have a very fascinating guest who's going to share stories of his over 6 decades in broadcasting and showbiz. Barry ZeVan has been described by no less a figure than Vice President Walter Mondale as a television personality with personality. He has spent his life as a broadcaster, weatherman, writer, documentarian, ski instructor, and now with his autobiography, Barry ZeVan, My Life Among Giants, an author. He has rubbed elbows with everyone from James Dean to John Ehrlichman and Woody Allen to Vern Gagne. I'm delighted he took time out of his busy schedule to join us on the show. And now, with no further ado, Mr. Barry ZeVan. Barry, so nice to meet you in person.
Nice to meet you, Paul.
I've seen you quite a bit over the years on the television, and you look even better in person.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. Yeah, I have a picture in my attic, me and Dorian Gray.
Well, you have a great book. I just finished it a few days ago. Barry ZeVan, My Life Among Giants.
Among the Giants,
Yeah, Among the Giants. Yeah. And there's very few people in the entertainment biz in the last 50, maybe 60 years that you haven't at some point rubbed elbows with.
Yeah, and actually had real relationships with. It wasn't because of interviews or anything else. I was born into the business, and my grandfather was one of Milton Berle's and George Burns and Gracie Allen's agents, and he was first violinist for the Pittsburgh Symphony in 1938 under Fritz Reiner, and Oscar Levant was a huge friend of our family in Pittsburgh before he went to Hollywood. Same with Gene Kelly, who I got to know later on. And it just, it never ends. It just never ends.
And you started out as an actor.
Yeah. Well, actually, I started out as a voice singer on
right.
KDKA radio in Pittsburgh, the world's first commercial radio station. And that was in 1943, February 20th, 1943. And in the KDKA archives now on the internet, there's actually a picture of me with the other kids while we were singing. And it just, Peter Marshall from Hollywood Squares started on that show just several years before I did.
Really?
And we're dear friends too, thank God.
Your mother was a big supporter of you early on.
Yeah, but she wasn't a stage mother. She figured I had some sort of talent, but she wasn't sure what.
Right.
And so she actually, I did start, I say I started out as a singer, which is true, but acting was my passion, but only by accident. She had heard the Pittsburgh Playhouse was going to have auditions for kids to go to their drama school on Saturday mornings, so she got me into the drama school, and one of my fellow students was Shirley Jones from Smithton, Pennsylvania. And so Shirley and I took lessons from a guy named Bill Putch, and Bill later married a lady named Jean Stapleton. And my daughter Shonda dated Jean Stapleton and Bill Putch's son, John Putch, one time anyway in Pennsylvania when we were living in Washington, D.C. And so it's been quite a life. And then Shirley, I did her first play with her when she became Miss Pittsburgh in 1951. It was called Wonderful Good. It was about the Pennsylvania Dutch. So, and Shirley and I still keep in touch pretty frequently.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, radio was the popular medium when you were growing up, but television was just coming online as well.
Yes, and I had a big break there too. I had been a contestant. My mom had taken us to New York. This was before we moved there. This was in 1946. 46, I was on a show called Give and Take. It was a CBS national program with John Reed King, and Bill Cullen was the announcer. And so Bill was from Pittsburgh, by the way,
Right.
my hometown too. So,
And Bill went on to do What's My Line?
oh, he went on to do everything. After the radio program, the producer said to my mother, "We would like to have your son be on television tonight down at near Grand Central Station." And we didn't know what television was, because the nation didn't get television until 1948, 2 years later. So this was an experimental program, but the first regularly scheduled program ever. It was called King's Party Line. New York City had 600 television sets. And so it was a test to see how many people were watching. So they put me on that night. If you recall, and you having lived in New York City, you know this building at the end of Park Avenue is called the New York General Building, right behind Grand Central Station.
Sure.
So that's where the CBS, even the CBS soap operas were performed too in later years, in that same studio. So they had some guy guess my hat size. I was coached to say, "Yes, Mr. King, that's correct," or "No, Mr. King, that's not correct."
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and some guy from the Bronx guessed my hat size, and they were so elated with my personality, is what they said, that they asked my mom if we could stay, if CBS paid for us to stay for a couple more weeks, and that's what we did.
Was that when you were at the Edison Hotel?
Yes.
Because I've stayed there.
Yep.
I stayed there in the mid-'80s when I was out for a music conference. But there's a great story in your book that really struck me. It's just kind of, it just shows you how interesting America is, and especially when you've lived a life as long as you have. But there was a saxophone player in the band at the hotel, a young man by the name of Alan Greenspan.
That's right.
Who became the head of the Fed.
Yeah, and he was with Henry Jerome's orchestra,
Right.
which was the house orchestra at the Edison Hotel there.
Right.
I stayed at the Edison again 2 years ago for Ann Mira's memorial service at the Eugene O'Neill's Theater, and where I also had a good breakfast with Tony Randall's widow, who I still keep in touch with. But anyway, there's no place in the Edison now for any kind of a house band or anything else.
Yeah.
It's a miracle they have a restaurant. Nothing against, I don't want to get sued by the Edison Hotel, but
Right.
it's a lot different than it used to be.
Right. Now let's move ahead a few years to the show Mr. Peepers,
Yes.
because this is some really interesting actors that you rubbed elbows with. Well, you were just grown up, maybe you you couldn't reach their elbow, but tell us about Mr. Peepers.
Well, I actually developed, thanks to Tony, a lifelong friendship with Tony Randall, because Tony played a teacher called Harvey Wescott in the show. And so Wally Cox, of course, was Peepers, and Wally was a delight.
What was the show exactly? What was it?
Well, it was about Jefferson Junior High. It was a fictitious junior high school, and there's quite a story about it, really, on how Tony almost didn't take the part. The producer named Fred Coe was one of the geniuses of early television, a guy from the South, a real Southern gentleman, and he called Tony and said, "I've just written the beginning of a sitcom. We're going to call it Mr. Peepers, and I've written a part just for you." And Tony said, "I'm not interested." He said, "I'm directing plays down at the Circle in the Square in the Village."
He was an artist.
Yeah, artiste, yes. Tony was so uppity. He was wonderful. He was like a father to me, a mentor. And so anyway, Tony kept refusing Fred Coe, and Fred finally said, "Tony, you have got to do this, because the show is going to be dependent on your personality interacting with Wally's." And Tony finally said yes. He said it was the biggest decision he ever made in his life, because he didn't realize the power of television. Now, this is in 1952. And so he said after the first show, and of course we're all live, no tape, And after the first show, it was a riot too. I can watch myself now on some of the episodes on the internet. But anyway, he said he had to go to Philadelphia for something, and we were live on Sunday nights, and he had to be in Philly maybe on Monday and Tuesday. And he's walking down the street, pardon me, and I get all choked up. But anyway, he's walking down the street, and people started pointing their fingers at him. And then some lady, said, "Oh my God, you're what's his name on that show?" And so, yeah, he said, then I realized the power of television, as you said.
Well, if you fast forward to 1964 when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan those 2 weeks in a row, they said both those nights the crime rate in New York City dropped to almost zero.
Yeah, well, two dear friends of mine were on that episode of The Sullivan Show.
Really?
Charlie Brill and Mitzi McCall.
Okay.
Mitzi was the first young actress I ever worked with at Pittsburgh Playhouse who walked around the dressing rooms scantily clad.
God bless her.
And then Charlie Brill and I went to high school in New York together at the Lodge Professional Children's School. And Charlie and Mitzi are still married.
Wow.
But they were the comedy act that night on The Sullivan Show when
Really?
the Beatles were on, yeah.
Tell us a little, now we'll go back 10 years to the Mr. Peepers thing. Wally Cox, and we were talking right before the show started tonight about one of America's greatest actors, Marlon Brando.
Uh-huh.
Tell us about
Wally
and
Tony were, Wally and Marlon were roommates. Yeah, and actually Marlon discovered Wally in Michigan. Wally's from Lapeer, Michigan, and I got to know his family in many later years after Wally even died. But Marlon just recognized that Wally had a specialness about him. It's definitely a character because he spoke like this. Now, you children, you better be nice or I'll kick you off the show.
I've got Barry ZeVan on. He's got a great book called My Life Among the Giants. We're going to be talking about his 60-year history, his personal life, his artistic projects, and whatever else Barry wants to chat about on the Wall of Power Radio Hour.
To feed two systems which exist right now. One centered over Colorado, and the other one I can't find. No, the other one is beginning to develop along the Montana-Idaho border. 17 degrees in Butte, Montana this morning for the nation's official low, which is officially low enough. Today, 74 at both New York and Washington, 67 at Winnipeg, with 1/100th of an inch of moisture the past 24 hours. And Calgary today had a low of 19 degrees this morning. 73 was our high in the Twin Cities today. 62 the low this morning with a trace of precipitation. Broken clouds, 60 degrees. The forecast extended Thursday through Saturday is mostly cloudy with showers or occasional rain Thursday. Clearing Friday and clear on Saturday, they say.
Welcome back to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Paul Metsa. My guest in the studio for the whole show tonight, a man about town, a broadcaster, a writer, a documentarian, and an amazing storyteller, Mr. Barry ZeVan.
Thank you, sir.
Barry, we ended the last set. You were talking about Wally Cox and Marlon Brando in New York City. Tell us a little bit more about what Marlon Brando was like.
Well, Marlon was very quiet. He really didn't talk that much. And there was one night when we were in Wally's apartment, his and Wally's apartment, because the accountant for Wally was a guy named Mr. Tobias. Well, Alan Tobias, because of his father's connection with Wally, was one of our students on Mr. Peepers. And so,
funny how that works.
Yes, so we were actually, Alan had a key to Wally's and Marlon's apartment. So we would just go up there and hang out. They didn't even have a television set.
Really?
They had hardly anything in that apartment. All we would do is hang out there and talk. One night it was pouring rain, and I think the story's in the book, but Anyway, Wally came home first. He said, "Are you children still here? You should please go now. Go now." Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right.
Yes, Wally. So we start to go, and here comes Marlon with a bicycle on his shoulder, having ridden in the pouring rain.
Right.
And his hair was all done. Hey, you kids, yeah. Yeah. It was kind of like that.
Right.
I don't know. But anyway, then I was with Marlon a couple of other times when he was doing the things for the American Indian movement, and but still very, he didn't talk much. He didn't talk much.
So tell us about New York City in the 50s.
Well, it was like that film My Favorite Year with Peter O'Toole.
One of my favorite films.
Yeah, it was like that. People were happy. People were upbeat. Truman and Eisenhower were president, overlapping in the early 50s, and I got to know Mr. Truman too. That's also in the book. But anyway, it was magic time. It was the New York City of On the Town, with Gene Kelly and Frank Sinatra and so forth, and Jules Munchin, and I just it's hard to remember that. It's not hard to remember, but it's difficult to know that it's not like that anymore.
Right.
I mean, New York's very exciting. It'll never be less than exciting. Times Square in those days, though,
Was Times Square.
Oh, I'm getting goosebumps, really, talking about it now, and I almost want to cry because it was that. No words. I'm sorry, words are kind of my business, but not in this respect.
But it was really, that's where all the big dreams came true, right?
Yeah. And I was so lucky. It was really thanks to a kid with whom I went to school. I went to a school called, first Forest Hills High School.
I lived in Rego Park.
So did we.
Yeah,
8830 62nd Drive, right off Woodhaven Boulevard.
63rd and Queens Boulevard.
Well, you weren't far away.
And I used to, actually, I used to go jogging at Forest Hills High School.
Yeah. Well, I used to ride my bike around Flushing Meadow Park.
Oh, sure. Well, we could talk about Forest Hills for a little bit, because that's got quite a bit of showbiz history. Michael Landon, Captain Kangaroo, Peter Parker from Spider-Man went to Forest Hills High School.
Yeah, and the people with whom I went to Forest Hills High before I went to Lodge Professional Children's School were Ina Balin, who I convinced to stay in the business through an agent friend of mine, and there's a story about that in the book too, and Art Garfunkel.
Yeah,
and Marty
Garfunkel.
Ingalls, who became Shirley Jones' husband, but he used to protect me in lunch line. Oh. We were 1 year apart, and Marty had this flaming red hair, big tall guy, and here I am, this little fella, and he said, let him in lunch." Every lunch line.
And of course, one of the America's greatest punk bands, the Ramones, came from Forest Hills.
Oh, that's wild.
We got to go out and have lunch and talk about Forest Hills and Rego Park and Kew Gardens and the rest. There are great stories in the book. Two things that I really related to. Number one, your mother could type 125 words a minute.
Oh, yeah.
Which is amazing. Now, I'm a good typer, and it served me well. I could type 52 words a minute. But when you started to get your first demo tape together to get into broadcasting, she typed out, and I could see it because you don't Xerox this stuff, 75 introductory letters for her young son, young Barry.
Yes. Same, with the same verbiage, but the different,
right.
Dear Mr. Such and Such.
Right.
God bless her heart. God bless her heart.
Right.
Because, yeah, thank God she was the typist that she was. But she was very dedicated to me.
More with Barry and your host, Paul Metsa, after these messages. We're back with the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Paul Metsa. My guest in the studio for the whole show tonight, my new friend, Mr. Barry ZeVan. When we ended the last segment, Barry, your mother had just helped you package up 75 packages to send out to radio and television stations around the country.
Just radio stations.
Just radio.
Yeah.
So where did you get the first bite?
KCAP in Helena, Montana, for $55 a week as news director and disc jockey.
And what year was that?
1957.
Okay.
And it was a disaster because in New York, of course, and God bless him, my mentor there for radio was a guy named Phil Tonkin, who was one of the best mutual broadcasting announcers ever was, or best announcers ever. And he was my mentor for that. And he had me record my tape up at OR. I still have that reel-to-reel tape.
Oh.
I would not have hired me.
Right.
So anyway.
We got to get a copy of that.
Oh.
I'd love to hear it.
Oh my gosh. Okay. It's blackmail. So anyway, this fellow named Lou Torok, who was the manager of the station, sent a telegram. If you are still interested in Helena, Helena is interested in you. Well, I wasn't interested in Helena. I was just interested in getting a job. And so, thank God for him. But when I got out there, as you remember possibly, for radio, you had to be an octopus.
Right.
You're announcing, but you're slip-starting records, you're twirling magnetorter recorders, and all the time with the headsets on, you say, oh, and by the way, it's such and such and such. In the meantime, while you're still doing all this stuff. Engineering to me was pathetic. So the boss said, he said, I know you've got great talent. He said, but this is tough.
Right.
I said, well, I expected there would be engineers like they were at WOR in New York. So he said, well, I have a friend in Missoula, Montana, who owns a TV station. He said, you'd probably be much better on television anyway. And he said, I'm going to call, his name was Art Mosby. His daughter, Aileen Mosby, was the AP bureau chief in Paris, and she was very well known in newspaper circles.
Wow.
So anyway, Art was a gazillionaire. He started one of the biggest sub-developments in Missoula, which still exists, called Farviews. Anyway, so Mr. Mosby said to Lou Torok, okay, have him come over here and we'll see if it works out. So there's a story about my trip over to Missoula, which almost ended in my death, and it's true. But anyway, I got hired at, it was then KMSO TV, Channel 13 in Missoula, for $60 a week to be a switcher, director, announcer. And it's the same station where my granddaughter now is an anchor.
Wow, well, that's
Yeah.
incredible. You know, it's funny, my little history in radio, when I was a senior in high school, first year of junior college up in Virginia, Minnesota at Mesabi State, which we used to refer to as high school with ashtrays. I was on a little station called WHLB, which some people refer to as We Have Lousy Broadcasting. But actually it was a great little station. I used to be the weekend guy in the morning, the sunshine boy, from 6 a.m. to noon on Saturday and Sunday. And the program director at the time was a guy named Harley Hodgkiss, who was several years older than me. Harley worked there for a couple of years and then ended up in Missoula, Montana.
Oh, wow.
And he was on one of the radio stations, the voice of Missoula, Montana. I lost track with him for 20-some years, and about 10 years ago, he tracked me down. I was playing at Nice Polonaise at the time, and he showed up, we had dinner, and he was the head of the CNN radio network for several years.
Wow.
So, not bad from small AM radio stations, Montana. Well, look, you did pretty good. Harley did pretty good.
In later years, I worked in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and one of the competing station had a reporter named Don Oliver. Don Oliver went from Idaho Falls, Idaho, to the NBC network.
Wow.
As a network correspondent for NBC. So you can jump, leapfrog over everything else to get to the top, depending on who sees you, who all of a sudden you've inspired to want to hire you. And so, and as you know, I mean, to me, one of the sad parts about this business is there are so many talented people. Maureen O'Hara and I got to know each other pretty well. And during one conversation, she said, I hate this about this business. There are so many talented people who never get the breaks.
Right.
And there are people with no talent or half talent who get all the breaks. And it's just who's noticing you when and who's motivated to say, hey, you deserve a big break.
Well, Barry, that's what, there's dozens of fascinating stories in your book. But the one that, maybe it's because I was just paging through when I had time, but one of the first stories I read was Bob Newhart.
Okay, I had a talk show in Las Vegas on television.
And what year was this?
This is from 68 to 70. And in 70, Bob was on my show frequently. He was at the Desert Inn. It's a TV talk show in the mornings, in addition to doing the weather. And so one day, I was driving him back to the Desert Inn. He used to refer to my weather shows in his comedy act at the Desert Inn. He said, watch Barry ZeVan. He said, this guy's fantastic, blah, blah, blah. And what an honor that was. So anyway, driving him back one morning, he said, you know, you belong in a much bigger market.
Wait and see, the thrill is gone. The thrill is gone away for good. Oh, the thrill is gone. The thrill is gone away for good. You've done me wrong so very long. I treated you like a good man should. It's gone. It really is gone. It's gone.